Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 13. Our first question is from Cheryl from Canada, who asks, how does food affect our brain, especially when it comes to mental health, for example, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety?
Well, separate of the obvious, which is that our brain needs food, I think you're probably asking a more specific question. This speaks to what was a totally exciting thing some decades back, neurotransmitters. All right, neurotransmitters, they're made out of precursor molecules, they're made out of things. And a whole bunch of neurotransmitters are made out of simple dietary constituents, amino acids. For example, dopamine, norepinephrine are both made from this amino acid. Tyrosine, serotonin is made from tryptophan. Glutamate, the neurotransmitter glutamate, is an amino acid. So as soon as people were figuring this out, there was, oh my God, if you change the amount of neurotransmitter precursors in the diet, you could change the level of neurotransmitters in the brain. This was stuff in the 70s, a couple, Judith and Richard Wertman at MIT, and they sort of pioneered this. And this caused total excitement that you were going to be able to raise or lower levels of neurotransmitters non-pharmacologically, not having to use a drug to show, and instead just dietary stuff. And everyone was so excited and so anticipatory. And it turned out most of that was kind of disappointing in that you can't push it a whole lot with dietary manipulations. How come? Because your brain is this very isolated organ. There's this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which is very careful control of the brain exerts over what gets from your bloodstream into you. Your brain is immunologically privileged, even though not as much. The brain is really carefully regulating what it's taken up from the bloodstream. So it turned out that you really can't change the levels of that stuff a whole lot dietarily. This was a big disappointment in the field. As a side footnote to that, there's all sorts of excitement about the possibility that your gut microbiome may be influencing neurotransmitter levels. I've been a bit underwhelmed with that literature, but mainly what was tremendous excitement, you can dietarily fix all sorts of things that instead you're drugging out the wazoo these days. No, it turned out to be a disappointment.
Okay, so Donna from Mexico says, do you practice your comedy bits? Are your jokes part of your lectures from the beginning, or do they kind of appear in the moment?
Um, well, some of them are jokes I've been saying since the first Ronald Reagan administration. And the big challenge there is to make it seem spontaneous. And I have no reason to think that it still seems spontaneous. But some of them, yes, just occur to me on the spur of the moment. And usually you and I then have to edit it out afterward because they are imprudent. So that's the deal, Donna.
All right, so next, Glenn from Indiana says, I was born in 1952 after the chemical diethylstilbestrol, DES, was given to my pregnant mother in a controlled study with the hope that it would reduce miscarriage. Are you aware of any ongoing neurological studies regarding the fetal brain development of children born to these mothers, me, and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren? And the study is going to be linked in the description below, just so you all know.
Well, Glenn, you are officially what they call a DES baby. DES, diethylstilbestrol. It's a drug that's not quite a steroid chemically, but has some similarities to it and was able to mimic some aspects of estrogen. And it was given in the early 50s to block or to decrease the likelihood of somebody miscarrying. Women who had lost a number of pregnancies in a row were put on DES, and immediately it was recognized there was a downside, which is it increased the risk of some reproductive related cancers that are estrogen dependent types of cancers, ovarian, all of that. But trade-off, and hundreds of thousands of women were given DES over the decades, and it was not until people looked closely that it turned out that, in fact, it had essentially no effect on miscarriage risk, yet it was given over and over, so there was that domain. But what people then began to figure out is interesting stuff happened to people who were fetuses while mom was being given DES, the DES babies. And a couple of types of reproductive cancers were more common. Premature births and some of the associated complications of that, neurodevelopmental disorders, increased likelihood of cerebral palsy, of ADHD, of autism spectrum disorder. Boys who were DES babies had an increased likelihood of hypospadia, which is basically having the opening of the penis in the wrong place on the side. Other versions of genitalia ambiguity and stuff. So immediately the question is how big of effects these were. And some of them were pretty small, depending on your tastes. The elevated autism spectrum risk is in the range of 50%. The ADHD, about a 30% increase. The risk of premature birth and complications with that, 5-fold, 10-fold. And what you see is, this is frequently the case for this sort of literature, the first study, because it's the first study and it had to be a whopping big effect to make people want to publish it, was pretty alarming. Over the years, the risk ratio has toned down a bit. Nonetheless, this is a real thing in the literature, which then brings up Glenn's question of what about the kids of the DES babies, the second generation. And it turns out you're seeing a lot of the same risk things there. Elevated risk of things like attention deficit disorder or ADHD, a small literature now on autism spectrum, a small literature on premature births and neurodevelopmental disorders. So that raises three issues immediately. How big are these effects? And again, these ones in the neurological realm are in the 25% to 50% increased risk. The second question being, how much should you panic as a result of that? And have they seen this now in the great-grandkids? I don't think they've shown it in great-grandkids yet, but it will not surprise me if they see it. It will also not surprise me if it's a less dramatic effect with each passing generation. But the third point there is, wait, how is this turning out in the grandkids? Your grandmother took a drug in the 1950s. How is this working? And there's a couple of models for it. One is if you were a fetus while mom was taking DES, it caused changes in you, including in cells destined to become sperm or eggs, depending on which, and that was a mechanism for passing on. Another mechanism is one now labeled with this very trendy term, epigenetics, in that fetal exposure to a drug can cause changes in a way that would then be passed on to the next generation without it having to necessarily cause a change in eggs or sperm, a change in proteins, regulatory proteins that regulate gene expression, things of that sort, which puts us into a realm of stuff called endocrine disruptors, environmental pollutants and stuff that turn out to have mimicking effects of certain steroid hormones, estrogen in particular, that may have some long-term effects there. What's the biggest punchline? You get something like this, and generations later, even though the size of the ripple seems to decrease with each generation, the effects there for generations afterward. So much for a drug that supposedly was preventing the chances of miscarriage and turning out not to at all. And now, many, many decades later, there's still an increased risk, and it's then a matter of taste or punching it out as to how bad of a risk 25% increased risk is. But yeah, generations later, there is still an effect from having been DES taking woman in the 1950s.
Our next question is, which scientists do you think you could take in a fight? This is sort of the next Elon Musk versus Mark Zuckerberg kind of situation, I
Okay.
think.
Well, that wonderful question. First off, noting that there's very few such scientists I could take in a fight, but I'd have to pick Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead, social anthropologist, I would say for two reasons. First off, I'm short, and she was even shorter as she became very elderly. The other advantage is that she's been dead for a long time, so that would have to tilt things in my favor. Complications there. It is debatable whether Margaret Mead counted as a scientist, and in even some circles, it's debatable how much of a social anthropologist she counted as. What she was most famous for was saying that growing up adolescent and female in Samoa was the grooviest thing on earth. People there had completely guilt-free, consequence-free, polyamorous sex there, and it was such a groovy non-Western society that things like perimenstrual syndrome were unheard of, and suggesting that all sorts of affective things connected with endocrine modulations was mostly a function of being an uptight Westerner. And it was subsequently shown that probably most of what she reported was her reporters, her informants, just making up crap because this like white lady was going to write it. Let's tell her that we have sex all the time, and let's tell her that PMS, who ever heard of? We don't get that here, never heard of it. And she lapped it up because she had a strong hidden agenda for Western somatization of disease. So I don't know if she counted as a scientist. I don't know if she counted even as a social anthropologist anymore. But my guess is by old age, she did not pack much of a wallop with her right hand, so I would take her on any day. So the dead elderly Margaret Mead would be my choice.
All right, so finally, Helen from Ukraine asks, does research confirm the possibility of stable remission after a case of severe clinical depression, or is the risk of returning never quite zero?
Well, so appropriate getting a question like this from somebody in Ukraine. Go figure. What we have here is, in a sense, a false dichotomy between depressions that are just biological. You're just endogenous. It doesn't matter how wonderful and non-stressful and non-adverse the world is around you. You're just going to have a depression versus what people used to call a reactive depression, which is, well, in response to something awful happening to you. And this turns out to be a false dichotomy because there's an interesting transition between reactive depressions and then endogenous ones. And the role that's critical for that is stress, major stress. What you see often is somebody's first episode of a major depression, not, oh, you've been feeling down, but like incapacitating, horrible biochemical disorder. But most typically, you see somebody's first episode of depression is coming after a period of major stress, major trauma, loss of a loved one, any such version by that. In other words, perfectly fitting the it is in reaction to an awful environment. And what then comes down to is, well, you've just had this awful loss. If you feel devastated and unmotivated and no joy in life anymore for 13 and a half days, is that a normal response? And once it hits 14, ooh, 2 weeks after, now it counts as a depression. We've got, diagnostic arguments that are mostly driven by medical insurance and what they'll reimburse you for. Feel sad for 13 and a half days, that doesn't count yet. 14 days, pow, you've got an official diagnosis. So that as a complication right off the bat. But given that, the question then becomes what goes into this transition between most of us who would be driven into a major depressive episode by something traumatic enough, and people who now struggle with that for the rest of their lives. And there's this guy, Robert Post, who did some really interesting research, NIMH, bringing in a concept, kindling, kindling wood. You got, I don't know, I don't make fires for you, but you got like scraps of wood stuff. You want to get kindling wood up like that and put a match to it. And that's the stuff that makes a flame that gets the fire going. And kindling got used metaphorically in the neurological literature in the context of epilepsy. Things that would kindle would activate, would jumpstart the brain into an epileptic seizure, bursts of uncontrolled sort of synchronized hyperactivity and such. And Post, in a sense, borrowed that into the what is a kindling event in the environment? What is it that will throw a match into your genetic or developmental vulnerability to depression? And his notion was that, go get a major depressive episode after one awful legitimate trauma. And what most of the studies suggested was afterward, when you would fortunately come out the other end, you were at no more elevated risk of a subsequent major depressive episode than anybody else. It equilibrates. Second major trauma, fall into a depression, odds are more than 50-50 that you have no more elevated risk than anyone else. And I don't know what the current cutoff number is, but I think in his original studies, 3, 4, 5 times that you have a major traumatic stressor in life throwing you into a depressive episode, and there's a transition there. And that's where the system has been kindled. That's where, in effect, you have transitioned from major depressive episodes in response to exogenous awful events, reactive depressive, to endogenous. So in reaction to a stressor, in reaction to a stressor, in reaction to, and somewhere around then, it just begins to cycle on its own. And statistically at that point, what you see is this someone who is likely to be struggling with this tragically for the rest of their lives there. And no surprise, a ton of work has gone into trying to understand what is that transition to this beginning to run all on its own, rhythmically in a lot of cases, seasonally in a lot of cases. What is it that goes into some people having a lower or a higher threshold than others? How many of these traumas, how severe do they have to be before you have now thrown a match into the kindling and it now takes off on its own forever after? Incredibly important subject. And the answer thus is, if you've lucked out with only one massive trauma, like your country has only been demolished by one totalitarian state invading you, the odds are you're going to be okay afterward. Multiple of them, in a sense, the more mileage under the hood, the more cumulative wear and tear, the more likely the system is to transition from being in response to an identifiable, overt, punctate kick in the ass to it just beginning to cycle inevitably on its own. So I think that's the state of knowledge these days.
And that is it for episode 13. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.